Okay, so you wanted a deep dive. And, well, this case has it all.
It does.
Seriously, we've got drama, right? We've got conflict. We've got some really interesting legal decisions that I think are going to have lasting impact.
Absolutely.
So we are talking about the Sheldon v. Seraphim case. This was decided in the Ontario Superior Court of Justice.
May 8th of this year.
This year, so very, very recent. And I think what's really fascinating about this case is that, on the surface, it seems fairly standard, right? A separation, custody issues, all that.
You've got your consent order.
Yeah, just a typical separation case.
Right.
But what's lurking beneath the surface is really, really fascinating, and that's what we're going to unpack today.
Right. So we've got this case where a judge is essentially taking a stand against evidence of abusive behavior.
Yeah.
And it's I think, going to have some pretty big implications for future cases and how they unfold and how similar situations are dealt with.
Yeah. And of course, we're going to get into the juicy stuff, like the Shakespearean text messages. That's always fun.
Oh, yeah. Always.
But I think what's even more impactful about this case is that the judge's decision really shines a light on what is referred to as coercive control as a form of family violence, which is something that is getting increasingly more attention. And it's really important to be aware of this, especially if you're going through a separation yourself or if you know someone who is going through a separation, because it really sort of brings to light some of the more subtle ways that abuse can manifest. And it sort of compels us to think about, how these things are dealt with in the legal system.
It does. And what's really interesting is that this judge, Justice Breithaupt Smith, she's really kind of pushing the boundaries. And she's saying that, we need to look beyond these consent orders.
Yes.
And these temporary orders. And if there's evidence of abuse or harm to the children, then we can revisit that.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, so let's set the stage here. We've got Mark Sheldon and Tashina Seraphim, and they started living together in 2013, got married in 2018, and they have two sons, London, who is 3 years old, and Levi, who was just born this past March, so, fairly young children. Yeah. And they separated in August of 2023 while Tashina was actually still pregnant with Levi.
Yes.
So you can imagine, that's already a stressful situation.
Oh, absolutely. Hormones raging.
Yes.
High stress. Yeah.
And this is where it starts to kind of go off the rails, right? So they had a custody agreement in place that was based on what's called minutes of settlement, which outlined things like, father's parenting time, how they were supposed to communicate. And this agreement became what's called a Madsen order. So it's a temporary order, court order, I should say, based on their consent. So they both agreed to it.
They both agreed.
So far, so good.
Right. Seems fairly standard.
Fairly standard. This is how a lot of these things go. But here's where it gets really interesting. A big chunk of the evidence in this case comes straight from the father's own words.
His own words.
His own words. And these are his messages on a platform called Our Family Wizard. Have you ever heard of this?
I have.
So it's it's a platform that a lot of separated parents use to communicate, especially about the kids. And it's supposed to be, a safe space, right, for communication. Yeah. But in this case, the father's messages really kind of blew that out of the water. It wasn't just a couple of heated exchanges here and there. It was a whole pattern of disrespect, anger, manipulation. He was constantly lashing out at the mother, making accusations, even trying to turn their son London against her and her parents. Like straight up, like grandma and grandpa are bad.
Yeah, alienating.
Yeah.
And that's a huge issue that comes up a lot in these high conflict cases.
Absolutely. And I think what's really, really disturbing is the timing of some of these messages. So just days before Levi was born, he sends this incredibly bitter message to Tashina, basically laying out all his resentment, even talking about how he's going to poison the children's minds against her when they're older.
Wow.
Yeah, like not even pretending to, and I mean, I guess we should kind of clarify here, right? This is one side of the story.
Yes.
We're looking at the evidence presented in this case, and this is what the judge based her decision on.
Exactly.
But it's important to remember, this is one perspective, but it's what was presented in court, and the judge clearly found it compelling. And this is what's so fascinating about it, because it's a classic example of what we call coercive control. And it's a form of abuse that often flies under the radar, right? It's not necessarily physical violence, but it's this pattern of behavior designed to make the victim feel trapped, isolated, dependent. And the father's messages, they're just full of this. He's constantly blaming the mother for everything, playing the victim, even boasting about winning previous court motions, which,
When in reality, it's just temporary orders, right?
Yeah.
Based on consent.
Based on consent. So there's this real lack of self-awareness and this tendency to sort of twist the narrative to his advantage, which is really, really concerning. And it makes you kind of wonder, what's really going on behind closed doors.
Absolutely.
And then there's this whole subplot about the father claiming to have PTSD.
Oh, yeah. From the separation.
But here's the thing. He provides zero evidence to back this up.
Right.
No diagnosis, no treatment records, nothing. And, look, I'm not saying he doesn't have PTSD.
Right.
That's not for us to decide. But the lack of evidence is pretty glaring, especially in a legal context, right?
Yeah.
And if he is struggling, there's no mention of him seeking treatment or taking any steps to manage it, which raises concerns about his stability, right?
Absolutely.
And whether he's capable of making sound decisions, especially when it comes to his children. So you've got this intense conflict, right? A lot of it documented by the father himself, and this lack of insight into his actions and the impact it's having on his children. And all of this is happening while their eldest son, London, is starting to have some behavioral issues, biting, choking, having trouble sleeping.
And this is where it gets really tricky, right?
Yes.
Because toddlerhood is difficult.
It is.
So how do you distinguish what is typical behavior and what might be related to the conflict, or maybe even exacerbated by the conflict between the parents?
Right, exactly. And this is where you really see the different perspectives of the parents come into play. So the father, he basically dismisses these issues, right? So he's like, oh, this is just typical toddler stuff, boys will be boys, that kind of thing. Right. But the mother is deeply concerned, and she's seeing it as potential signs of stress and emotional dysregulation.
Yeah, she's on the receiving end of those messages.
Exactly. So she's got a very different perspective on what might be causing these issues. And what's really troubling is that the father actually admits to encouraging London to bite his mother.
Oh, my gosh.
Yeah.
Wow.
Even using phrases like, bite mommy's boob off. I mean, come on.
That's not typical toddler behavior.
No, it's not. And it shows a complete lack of understanding of child development and the potential harm that this kind of language and behavior can have. And it makes you wonder, right? What's really going on when these kids are in his care? Aside from mentioning London's nut allergy, he provides very little detail about their lives, what they do, where they go, who takes care of them when he's not available. It's a real contrast to the mother's detailed accounts of their daily routines and activities.
It's almost as if he's trying to minimize her role as a parent, even though she's been the primary caregiver.
Yeah, exactly. And simultaneously paint himself as the victim, right?
Right.
Woe is me. I'm going through this separation. I'm being alienated from my children. And it's a tactic that the judge sees right through.
Absolutely.
So we've got this intense conflict, right? A lot of it documented by the father himself. We've got concerns about his stability and his understanding of his children's needs. And now we've got this really interesting legal decision that comes down that has potentially huge implications for how family law is handled moving forward. So that's what we're going to get into in the next part of our deep dive.
I'm excited.
It's good stuff.
This is where it gets really interesting.
It does. So stay tuned.
We'll be right back. Okay, so before we went down this rabbit hole of Mark's behavior in those messages,
Yeah.
we were talking about the initial custody agreement, the Madsen order, which was based on their consent.
Right.
But obviously things had changed, and Justice Breithaupt Smith realized that things were not as they had seemed when they initially made that agreement.
Yeah, and it's like she's basically saying that, those initial agreements, they're important, but they're not set in stone.
No.
Especially when you start to see, evidence of potential harm to the kids. And I think that's a really important takeaway from this case, is that, just because you sign a piece of paper doesn't mean that that's the end of the story.
Yeah, it's a huge shift, I think, in family law, because there is so much weight given to agreements that parties reach.
Absolutely.
Especially when you're talking about things like shared parenting and decision-making.
Mm-hmm.
But this case shows that, there's a growing awareness that sometimes those agreements, they might not actually be in the best interest of the kids.
No.
Especially when there's evidence of abuse or coercive control going on.
So what did Justice Breithaupt Smith actually do? Like, what changes did she make?
Well, she made some pretty big changes. So remember the original agreement, Mark was supposed to have unsupervised parenting time with the kids, like several days a week.
Right.
That's all gone.
Okay.
So no more, bite mommy's boob off kind of moments.
Yeah, they're kidding.
So what she did is she ordered that all of Mark's visits with the children have to be supervised.
Okay.
At a designated center.
Okay.
And he has to pay for it.
Oh, wow.
All the costs associated with these visits.
Okay.
He has to bear the financial burden of that.
So supervised access, that's a pretty big change.
Huge change.
And it sounds like she wasn't just worried about the kids' physical safety, but also their emotional well-being, right?
Absolutely. And this is where the concept of coercive control really comes into play.
Okay.
Because she recognized that Mark's behavior, his messages, his whole approach to parenting, it was creating a toxic environment for these kids.
Yeah.
And she was not going to let that continue.
So let's talk about coercive control a little bit more, because I think it's a term that not everybody's familiar with.
Right.
Can you break it down for us? Like, what does that actually mean?
Sure. So coercive control, it's a form of domestic abuse, but it's not about physical violence necessarily. It's more about manipulation and control. It's this pattern of behavior where one person is trying to basically make the other person feel trapped.
Okay.
Isolated, dependent on them.
So like constant criticism, threats, that kind of thing.
Absolutely.
Like using the kids as pawns, or like financial control.
All of that, yeah.
Okay.
And in this case, Justice Breithaupt Smith, she saw all those red flags in Mark's behavior. The constant blaming of Tashina, trying to alienate London from her, just the disregard for London's emotional needs.
All right.
It all pointed to this pattern of coercive control.
And so she said, no way.
Pretty much, yeah.
Like she wasn't gonna let that slide.
Right, and I think she recognized that if she upheld that original agreement, she would be basically condoning this abusive behavior.
Right, because it would just continue.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's really significant that she recognized that coercive control can be just as damaging, if not more so, than physical abuse.
Right.
Especially for kids.
Yeah, because they're so vulnerable.
Exactly. They're still developing.
Right.
They don't have the emotional maturity to kind of understand what's going on.
And what about decision making for the kids? Did she address that as well?
Oh yeah, for sure. So she actually awarded sole decision making authority to the mom, to Tashina.
Okay.
So this means that, she gets to make all the major decisions about the children's lives.
Yeah.
Education, healthcare, religious upbringing, all of that.
Wow. Okay. So even though they initially agreed to share those decisions,
right,
the judge basically said, nope, based on everything I've seen, it's not safe.
Yeah, not going to happen.
happen.
Yeah. And it's a big deal because it really shows that the court is starting to take coercive control seriously. Yeah. And they're recognizing that it can impact a parent's ability to make sound decisions for their children.
Yeah, yeah. Wow, this is huge. I mean, this has got to have implications for other families going through similar situations, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, this case could set a precedent for how these cases are handled moving forward in Ontario.
Yeah.
It really highlights the importance of recognizing and addressing coercive control. And it also, I think, empowers victims to come forward and seek protection for themselves and their kids.
Yeah, and I think it also underscores the power of documentation.
Oh, yeah.
The fact that, Mark basically documented his own controlling and manipulative behavior in those messages. It was like his own downfall, in a way.
He basically created the evidence that was used against him.
Yeah, exactly. So it's a good reminder for anyone going through a separation, be mindful of what you're putting in writing. Yeah. Especially when you're communicating with the other parent, because those messages, those emails, those social media posts, they can come back to haunt you in court.
100%.
Yeah.
Digital trail.
So we've seen how, what seemed like a fairly straightforward separation really took a turn, revealed this pattern of coercive control.
Yeah.
And we saw how a judge really stepped up and made some groundbreaking decisions. But we're not done yet. In the final part of our deep dive, we're going to shift gears a little bit and talk about the broader implications of this case, what it means for families, facing similar challenges. Yeah. And we're also gonna get you, the listener, involved.
Yes.
And hear your thoughts and reactions.
I'm excited about that.
It's gonna be good. So stay tuned. All right, so we're back, and we've gone pretty deep into the Sheldon v. Seraphim case.
We have.
And, we've seen how what started as like a typical separation really took a dark turn, revealed this whole pattern of coercive control. And I think what's really remarkable is how the judge stepped in and made some like pretty big decisions to protect the kids.
Absolutely.
So, we've unpacked the evidence. We've looked at the judge's reasoning. We've talked about what this might mean for future cases.
Yeah.
But now I want to hear from you, the listener.
Right.
What are your takeaways from this whole deep dive? Like, what really stuck with you? What surprised you?
Yeah, what resonated?
I know for me, those text messages, wow. Talk about a digital trail of breadcrumbs.
Yeah, and I think it really highlights how important it is to be mindful of what you're putting in writing.
Yeah, especially when you're dealing with legal stuff.
Oh, absolutely.
It's like a permanent record of your thoughts and your actions, and
it can be used against you.
It can, yeah, for sure.
In court.
And, it made me think about those agreements that couples often sign, at the beginning of a separation.
Right, those consent orders.
And I think this case really shows that they're not always like the final word.
No.
Especially when you have this evidence of abuse.
Right, and I think it highlights how family law is kind of evolving to recognize these more complex situations.
Mm-hmm.
And I think courts are becoming more aware that just because something seems fair on paper, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's actually in the best interest of the children.
And speaking of fairness, we talked a lot about coercive control.
Yes.
And I'm curious, did learning about this concept kind of change how you think about like how abuse can show up in a relationship?
I think for a lot of people, it's a real eye-opener.
Yeah.
Because it's not always about the physical violence.
Right. No.
It can be much more subtle.
Yeah.
And it can be really hard to even recognize.
And to prove, right.
And to prove, yeah.
Because it's so insidious.
It is.
And it's like a slow burn,
Mm-hmm.
It just kind of wears the victim down over time.
Yeah, until they feel completely trapped and powerless.
And I think what's especially concerning is the impact this can have on kids.
Oh, absolutely.
Who are exposed to it, and it really makes you think about how these experiences might shape London and Levi's lives as they grow up. And I think what this case does is it offers like a glimmer of hope for anyone who might be experiencing this, It shows that the courts are starting to understand this form of abuse and that there are ways to get help, to protect yourself, to protect your children.
Absolutely. And if you're feeling trapped, if you're feeling unsafe, reach out.
Yeah.
Talk to someone you trust.
A friend, family member, a professional.
Yeah, you don't have to go through this alone.
So we've come to the end of our deep dive.
We have.
And I hope you found it insightful.
I hope so too.
I hope it's given you some things to think about.
It's definitely a case that stays with you.
It does.
It's powerful.
And I think it really underscores how important it is to understand these issues, to be aware of them.
Yeah.
So that we can better support each other.
Absolutely.
And advocate for a legal system that really puts the well-being of children first.
That's what it's all about.
That's what it's all about. So thanks for joining us on this journey.
Thanks for listening.
And we'll see you next time for another deep dive into the world we live in.